Picture this. It's the year 316 BC, and the city of Alexandria is still new, its marble streets echoing with the ambition of a dead conqueror. The sea wind carries the scent of salt and myrrh, and in the royal palace, under the banners of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a child is born. Her name is Arsinoe, daughter of Ptolemy the Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals, and his queen, Berenice III. From the moment she took her first breath, Arsinoe's life was not her own. She was born into a family that worshipped power, not gods, bloodlines, not love. The great Ptolemy, her father, had taken Egypt for himself after Alexander's death in 323 BC, crowning himself pharaoh and founding a new royal house that blended Greek intellect with Egyptian mysticism. To his court, every child was a chess piece in a game that spanned continents. As the years passed, the little girl learned early that affection in the palace came at a price. Her father was admired as a statesman and feared as a ruler. He adored knowledge, collected scholars, and built the Library of Alexandria. But his love for his children was strategic, not sentimental. By the time Arsinoe turned 10, she had already learned that daughters of kings did not belong to themselves. They were traded, promised, and positioned like the marble statues that decorated the palace halls. Every smile from a courtier, every whispered compliment, might one day become a weapon. A kingdom built on ruins outside the palace, Egypt was thriving. The Nile carried ships heavy with grain and gold. Temples rose like mountains to the gods. But the empire itself was fractured. The death of Alexander had divided the world into rival kingdoms, the so-called diadochi, or successors. They were former friends turned enemies, and the map of the ancient world shifted like sand beneath their feet. For Ptolemy I, survival meant marrying his children into the right alliances. For Arsinoe, that meant her future had already been sealed long before she could dream of love. At 13, she stood at her father's side during royal ceremonies, wrapped in linen and jewels, the image of divine grace. Yet even then, she understood her value was not in her beauty, but in her blood. She was both Greek and Egyptian, a living bridge between worlds, bred to secure her father's dynasty. Unlike many royal daughters of her time, Arsinoe was not kept idle. The Ptolemaic court prized intellect as much as charm. She was tutored by philosophers from Athens, historians from Rhodes, and mathematicians from Cyrene. She studied languages, strategy, astronomy, and most importantly, the art of persuasion. In the cool shade of the library's courtyards, she listened to men debate politics and ethics. She watched them argue over whether power corrupted or revealed a man's true nature. Those conversations would shape her for life. By her teenage years, Arsinoe had learned to keep her face still even when her heart trembled. She knew when to flatter, when to remain silent, and when a single look could be more powerful than 1,000 words. But knowledge could not protect her from destiny. In 300 BC, when Arsinoe was barely 16, her father made a decision that would define her youth. She was to be married to Lysimachus, a seasoned warrior almost 30 years older than her. Lysimachus ruled Thrace and parts of Asia Minor, a man whose scars were older than Arsinoe herself. The marriage was a transaction, a promise of peace between two crowns. It was celebrated with lavish feasts in Ephesus, where poets compared the young bride to Aphrodite herself. But the whispers behind the pillars told another story. The girl queen was a prize, a symbol, a fragile seal on a political pact that might break at any moment. When Arsinoe first met Lysimachus, He offered her a golden diadem set with emeralds. He called her my dove, but his hands were rough, his breath heavy with wine and age. She smiled and bowed, knowing better than to flinch. Inside, she felt nothing, neither love nor hate, just the cold understanding that this was her fate. The wedding night was not recorded in history, but it was the first time Arsinoe realized what it truly meant to belong to a man in a world ruled by men. She lay beside him in the dark, listening to the sounds of the sea crashing against the Thracian cliffs, and wondered whether her soul could ever be her own again. Over the next 2 decades, Arsinoe II transformed from a pawn into a queen. She bore 3 sons, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Philip, and slowly became her husband's political partner. The court in Thrace admired her intellect and beauty, calling her the Shining One. But Lysimachus was a man at war, with others and with himself. His enemies surrounded him: Seleucus of Syria, Antigonus of Macedon, and even former allies of Alexander's empire. Arsinoe learned to navigate the treacherous network of spies, betrayals, and assassins that defined Hellenistic politics. Her role was simple: keep her husband alive, her children safe, and the throne secure. But even that would prove impossible. By 282 BC, rumors began to spread. Lysimachus's eldest son from a previous marriage accused Arsinoe of plotting his death. The accusation came from Agathocles, a rival heir and a man beloved by the army. Whether the plot was real or fabricated remains unclear, but Lysimachus believed it. In a rage, he ordered Agathocles executed. The act shattered his court and turned his allies against him. Arsinoe watched her husband's empire crumble piece by piece, realizing that her life and the lives of her children were now in danger. When Lysimachus was defeated and killed at the Battle of Corupedium in 281 BC, Arsinoe's world collapsed. Her sons were suddenly orphans, she a widow without a kingdom, and the vultures of power were already circling. Not long after Lysimachus's death, another man appeared: Ptolemy Karanos, her half-brother, a ruthless opportunist who had seized the Macedonian throne. He offered Arsinoe safety, protection, and the restoration of her children's inheritance, if she married him. She hesitated. The very thought turned her stomach. But she was a widow in exile, her children's fate uncertain, her enemies closing in. Saying no was not an option. So, in a union that shocked even the cynical nobles of Macedonia, Arsinoe married her half-brother. It was her second marriage to kin, but not the last. Within months, Ptolemy's mask slipped. He grew paranoid, jealous of her sons, and obsessed with eliminating any threat to his power. In one of the darkest acts of betrayal recorded in ancient history, he murdered 2 of Arsinoe's sons with his own hands, slaughtering them in front of her eyes. She fled that same night, taking her youngest child and escaping across the sea to the island of Samothrace, then to Egypt, the land of her birth, the place where her story had begun. She did not yet know it, but Egypt would demand one final, unimaginable sacrifice from her. The ship that carried Arsinoe back to Egypt cut through black water like a blade. The air smelled of salt and smoke, and the wind stung her eyes. She stood at the bow, her hair tangled, her face expressionless. Behind her, the coastline of Thrace disappeared into mist, and with it, everything she had once been: a queen, a wife, a mother. The sea took her past the ruins of her old life, toward the one place that still bore her name. But Egypt, too, had changed. When she arrived at the port of Alexandria around 279 BC, the city shimmered like a mirage of marble and gold. the lighthouse of Pharos burned its eternal flame, guiding sailors toward the city that was said to never sleep. But for Arsinoe, that light felt more like an omen than a welcome. Her brother, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, now ruled Egypt, a man known for his intellect, his temper, and his thirst for absolute control. He had married once before, to a foreign princess named Arsinoe II, but had since divorced and exiled her under charges of conspiracy. Now, the throne beside him stood empty. Arsinoe II entered Alexandria under disguise at first. She had fled without an army, without wealth, without allies. Yet she still carried something far more dangerous: her royal blood. In a dynasty obsessed with legitimacy, she was a living key to power. Ptolemy II knew that. He had watched her rise and fall from afar, her name whispered in the corridors of politics. Now she had returned, fragile but alive, and to him, that made her both a threat and an opportunity. Their first meeting after so many years was not recorded in detail, but chroniclers described it as tense. Two children of the same father, molded by war and ambition, facing each other across a marble hall. The torches flickered, painting their faces in gold and shadow. She had lost her sons, her husband, and her place in the world. He had gained a kingdom, but at the cost of his humanity. When their eyes met, it was not family that connected them. It was the shared understanding of survival. What followed next would stun the ancient world. Ptolemy saw a chance to sanctify his rule. The Egyptians had long believed their pharaohs were divine, the earthly children of gods who often married within their own bloodline to preserve the sacred essence of royalty. Brother and sister unions among gods were celebrated: Isis and Osiris, Geb and Nut. To the Greeks, it was blasphemy. To the Egyptians, it was divine order. Ptolemy, hungry to legitimize himself not just as a ruler but as a god, decided to adopt that ancient tradition. Arsinoe was his answer. No one dared to ask whether she agreed. Historians would later argue that the union was political, that she consented to protect herself, to secure her survival. But those who wrote in whispers, not ink, claimed otherwise, that she was persuaded, that the choice was presented as destiny, not desire. After all, what could a woman alone against a king say, except yes? The marriage took place around 273 or 272 BC in the Great Temple at Alexandria. The air was thick with incense and fear. The priests of Ptah and Isis presided, chanting blessings that blended Greek and Egyptian tongues. The people outside the temple were told they were witnessing a divine union, the rebirth of the gods themselves. But those who knew the truth called it something else: a coronation born of coercion. That night, the city exploded in celebration. Golden torches lit the harbor, music echoed through the palace gardens, and statues of Arsinoe and Ptolemy were paraded side by side. Coins were minted showing their profiles together, identical in posture, divine in design. The inscriptions named them Philadelphoi, the sibling lovers. The irony was bitter. Behind closed doors, the queen wore the same calm expression that had saved her 100 times before. She had learned that silence was armor, and that in the world of men, a woman's endurance could be more dangerous than her rage. Yet as she walked beside her brother through the halls of their ancestors, she must have known what history would remember. Not her strength, not her pain, but the scandal of her blood. Still, Arsinoe adapted. She always did. If she could not escape the role forced upon her, she would master it. Within a year, she became more than a queen. She became a symbol. Statues of her appeared in temples. Priests spoke her name in the same breath as Isis. The people began to believe she was divine, a living goddess who ruled with her brother as one soul in two bodies. She played the part flawlessly. Her voice in the court grew stronger. Her influence spread beyond Alexandria to the provinces of the Nile. She learned to use ritual and religion as tools of command. When Ptolemy spoke, she echoed him. When he hesitated, she decided. Slowly, the line between queen and ruler blurred. But beneath the gold and incense, the truth remained. She had married her brother because the world had left her no other way to live. The child born in the marble halls of Alexandria had become the queen of Egypt, not through love, not even through ambition, but through the brutal logic of survival. As years passed, their union became legend. Greek poets were forced to write odes comparing them to gods, though in private they mocked the marriage as unnatural. Foreign rulers whispered about it in disgust, yet many began to copy it. The idea that bloodlines could purify power took root, spreading like poison through royal courts from Syria to the Aegean. The propaganda worked. By blending divine mythology with royal politics, Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II redefined kingship. Egypt thrived under their rule. Trade expanded, temples flourished, and the library reached new heights. To the public, they were the golden pair, shining with divine favor. But behind the silk curtains of the palace, the woman called goddess still woke at night, haunted by the faces of her murdered sons and the ghosts of choices she never had the power to make. In 270 BC, after years of rule, Arsinoe's health began to fail. Some said she fell ill, others whispered of poisoning, though no one dared speak whose hand might have poured the cup. When she died, Ptolemy ordered the creation of the cult of Arsinoe Philadelphus, declaring her not just a queen, but a goddess eternal. Her temples stretched from Alexandria to the islands of the Aegean. Her image carried on coins long after her body had turned to dust. In the end, history would call her divine, but divinity was her prison. She had been born a daughter, sold as a bride, crowned as a sister, and worshipped as a god. Every title she gained took another piece of her humanity, and though the world remembered her as a goddess of love and fertility, perhaps the truer title was one no poet ever wrote: the woman who survived the will of men. When Arsinoe's body was laid to rest, the Nile itself seemed to mourn. The priests spoke her name as if it were flame, not flesh. The marble steps of the temple were washed with milk and honey, offerings to a woman who was no longer a queen, but something far more useful to those left behind: a myth. Ptolemy II ordered her body wrapped in linen soaked with precious oils. The tomb built for her was unlike any before it, a fusion of Greek symmetry and Egyptian divinity. At its center stood a statue of Arsinoe carved in pure alabaster, her eyes inlaid with lapis, her mouth curved in that familiar calm smile that had outlived every tragedy. She was crowned not as a widow, not as a sister, but as Thea Philadelphos, the goddess who loved her brother. It was not grief that drove this transformation. It was politics. Ptolemy understood what she had represented in life: power disguised as purity, control veiled in worship. In death, she could serve him even better. He declared her divine, equal to Isis herself, and her cult spread like wildfire. Priests built temples in her honor from Alexandria to Memphis, even as far as the island of Delos in the Aegean. Sailors prayed to her for safe voyages. Farmers offered fruit to her altars at harvest. The woman who had once been a pawn was now immortalized, as the queen who became a goddess. And yet, those who had known her in life whispered that she never wanted it. They said she feared being forgotten, yes, but not remembered this way. She had spent her years balancing survival against conscience, caught between the myths of Egypt and the morals of Greece. Now she was neither. She was divine propaganda. In the decades that followed, Arsinoe's cult became a tool of empire. Every new ruler of the Ptolemaic line invoked her name to justify their throne. Marriages between siblings became not scandal, but ritual. The marriage of Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II had rewritten what power looked like in Egypt. And once the line was crossed, there was no going back. By the time Cleopatra VII was born more than 2 centuries later, sibling marriage had become an unquestioned tradition. To the outside world, it was decadence. To Egypt, it was holiness. But the roots of that tradition began here, with a woman who had no real choice and a brother who turned her submission into sanctity. Every dynasty needs its saints. Arsinoe became Egypt's. There is a story told by later Alexandrian scholars that one night, years after her death, a tremor shook the temple built in her honor. The statue of the queen, they said, split along its spine, revealing a hollow chamber inside. Within it lay a gold amulet engraved with a single phrase in Greek, "For my sons." No one knew if it was true, but if it was, it meant that even as priests called her divine, she had not forgotten the blood that had been spilled to make her holy. The sons murdered by her half-brother, the life she had lost in her first marriage, the cost of her throne. It all lived in the silence of that golden charm. It is one of history's cruelest ironies. The very woman who became the symbol of divine sibling love was herself destroyed by the men who claimed to love her. Her brother continued to rule until 246 BC, dying as one of Egypt's wealthiest and most powerful kings. He was buried beside her, as he had decreed, their tombs joined by a corridor lined with lotus carvings. Some said it was an act of eternal devotion. Others called it the final act of possession, that even in death, he would not let her be free. Years later, travelers who entered her shrine wrote of an eerie presence that filled the air. Women came to her altars not to worship, but to beg for mercy, for deliverance from the fates their husbands and fathers had forced upon them. To them, Arsinoe was not a goddess of love, but of endurance. She was the patron saint of women who survived what they could not escape. Her name faded slowly from Greek records, but lived on in Egypt's sands. Coins bearing her likeness circulated long after her dynasty had fractured. Her image, serene, divine, untouchable, became a mask for every queen who followed, a silent warning wrapped in gold. And yet, beneath all the layers of myth and marble, her story was still that of a woman who had been forced to surrender herself to power. If you stand today among the ruins of her temple at Cape Zephyrium, where her cult once thrived, the wind carries whispers in 2 tongues, Greek and Egyptian, blending, as they always did in her life. You can almost hear the echo of her voice, calm but tired. Call me goddess if you must, but remember, I was human first. Centuries passed. Empires rose and crumbled. The marble of Alexandria cracked under the weight of time, and the gilded statues of the gods turned to dust. But Arsinoe's story refused to die. It lingered like smoke, retold, reshaped, and misunderstood by generations who needed her to be something more than she ever was. For the Egyptian priests who came after her, Arsinoe became the bridge between the mortal and divine, the perfect queen who bound earth and heaven through the purity of royal blood. They forgot, or perhaps chose to forget, that the purity they worshipped was born of coercion. For them, the marriage between Arsinoe and Ptolemy II was not an abomination, but a prophecy fulfilled, a mirror of the gods Isis and Osiris, reborn in human form. Her cult remained active for more than a century after her death. Pilgrims from across the Mediterranean brought offerings to her sanctuaries. Gold-leafed icons of Arsinoe were placed beside those of Isis and Aphrodite. In the inscriptions carved into temple walls, she was called the Eternal Sister, she who restores harmony to blood. The irony was lost to them. That harmony, in her life, had been bought with silence and fear. But outside Egypt, the Greeks and Romans told a different story. To them, Arsinoe was the symbol of moral decay, the queen who dared to defy nature itself. Philosophers in Athens wrote of her marriage with disgust, calling it Philadelphic madness. Roman historians centuries later would use her story as evidence of how Eastern monarchies corrupted reason with superstition and desire. They turned her into a warning, a figure of temptation, a woman who blurred the lines between sanctity and sin. And so, the same woman who had been worshipped as a goddess in Egypt became a villain in the eyes of Europe. It was a pattern that would repeat again and again. Every time a powerful woman rose in the shadow of a king, the world needed a myth to contain her. Arsinoe became that myth, the first of many queens whose stories were rewritten to make power seem dangerous in feminine hands. By the 1st century BC, when Cleopatra VII was born, the legend of Arsinoe II was already sacred. Cleopatra was raised in a palace lined with portraits of her divine ancestors. She learned to walk beneath ceilings painted with scenes of gods who married their own kin. In those frescoes, Arsinoe and Ptolemy appeared not as mortals, but as celestial beings, symbols of divine union and eternal rule. Cleopatra inherited that legacy. Her marriage to her brother Ptolemy III was not her idea, but tradition demanded it. The marriage was political, ceremonial, and yet the world outside Egypt recoiled in horror. The Romans called it barbaric. The Greeks whispered that the queen was cursed. None of them remembered that it had all begun centuries earlier, with a woman who never had the right to say no. When Cleopatra later took power on her own terms, she did what Arsinoe could not. She rewrote her image. She wore the crown of Isis, claimed divinity, and bent mythology to her will. But even she was haunted by the echo of that same story. The gods demanded perfection. The empire demanded heirs, and love had no place in either. Centuries later, long after both queens had been reduced to legend, the scholars of Europe rediscovered their names. Renaissance historians, sifting through papyrus and marble fragments, spoke of Arsinoe as the queen who sinned against nature. The irony of that phrase, written by men who ruled kingdoms through conquest and blood, hung heavy in the air. They could not see her for what she was, a woman trapped in a dynasty that worshipped power more than gods. To them, her marriage was a scandal. To her, it was survival. If you trace the lineage of European queens, you'll find echoes of her fate everywhere. Royal marriages arranged between cousins, uncles, nieces, all cloaked in the same language of duty, divine right, and blood purity. What began in Egypt as a symbol of sacred unity would, over millennia, become the justification for royal inbreeding across Europe. The Habsburgs, centuries later, would perfect that very idea, cousins marrying cousins until their bloodlines folded in on themselves, creating deformities both physical and moral. And though few would remember her name, it was Arsinoe's precedent, that gave them the illusion of legitimacy. She was the ghost behind every royal veil. In the modern world, her story lives on in fragments, inscriptions, coins, broken statues recovered from the ruins of Alexandria. Each fragment carries her likeness, serene, beautiful, impossible to read. Historians still argue whether she was victim or villain, strategist or survivor. But the truth is simpler. She was all of it. She was a woman born into an empire that used her body to build eternity. And perhaps that's why her story still unsettles us. Because it asks a question that has never really changed. How much of a woman's life can be taken from her before she becomes a symbol instead of a person? The answer lies in every marble face, every myth, every retelling that forgets her name, but keeps her image. In the glow of the museum lights today, the coins that once bore her profile still shine. The inscription reads, Philadelphoi, the sibling lovers. Two faces, side by side, looking in the same direction, forever bound by history's cruelty. The story that began with one forced marriage ended as a religion, a dynasty, and a warning carved into eternity. And if you listen closely, through the echo of centuries, you can still hear her whisper, I was never divine. I was just trapped. The desert keeps its secrets. The ruins of Arsinoe's temples lie buried beneath centuries of wind and silence, the columns half swallowed by sand. Once, those stones sang her name in prayer. Now, they hum only with the sound of the wind, the same wind that carried the scent of the Nile through her palace, the same that watched her rise and fall. Archaeologists who walk these ruins today find fragments, shards of marble bearing her image, coins with her brother's face pressed beside hers, inscriptions so faint they're almost ghosts. When the sunlight hits them just right, the gold dust glints like the edge of a forgotten crown. One fragment found near Cape Zephirium reads only, To the queen who became the goddess. Another, dug from the sand outside Memphis, adds a single line beneath. She was loved by her brother and feared by the world. But the more historians uncovered, the more they began to question the story that had survived. Was Arsinoe truly worshipped as a goddess, or trapped in the mask of one? Was her marriage to Ptolemy an act of power, or an act of surrender? The truth, as always, lives in the space between. Modern scholars agree on the facts that Arsinoe II was born around 316 BC, married 3 men, 2 of them her kin, and died around 270 BC. But the story behind those facts, the life between the lines, has always belonged to those willing to imagine her not as a goddess, but as a woman. Imagine her, standing before the temple doors on the morning of her wedding to her brother. The air heavy with incense, the crowd chanting, her name echoing in 2 languages. She stands still, dressed in gold that weighs more than her body, her hands trembling as priests declare her divine. And somewhere deep inside her, the girl she once was, the daughter of Ptolemy's palace, asks a question she cannot say aloud. If I am a goddess now, why do I feel so small? The years that followed turned that moment into legend. Artists sculpted her with the calm serenity of eternity. Poets praised her as a symbol of divine love. Even her enemies couldn't erase her. But beneath the perfection carved into stone, there is something else, a flicker of humanity, the faintest shadow of sorrow in her eyes. That's the part history tried to hide, because history prefers its queens flawless. It prefers them either holy or wicked, never human. When modern historians looked closer, the story of Arsinoe II became something more complicated and far more tragic. Her forced marriage had not only changed her own fate, but rewrote the blueprint of Egyptian royalty. It created a precedent that would trap generations of women after her, including Cleopatra, in the same gilded cage of divine blood. The cult that bore her name became a state religion. Her temples were built across the empire, her face painted beside that of Isis. She became Thea Philadelphos, the divine sister, the protector of kings. But her worshippers never knew that the goddess they prayed to had once wept for the sons she could not save. In the quiet halls of museums today, her story is retold not in chants or prayers, but in plaques and glass cases. A coin gleams, showing two profiles side by side, brother and sister, husband and wife, king and queen. Below, a caption reads, Ptolemy II Philadelphus and Arsinoe II, c. 272 BC. Visitors stop for a moment, tilt their heads, and move on. But if you linger, if you look closely into her carved eyes, you might sense the stillness there. It is not serenity. It is endurance. The kind that only comes from a life lived under the weight of power. Some historians call her the most influential queen of the Hellenistic world. Others call her the first woman in history to wield both Greek intellect and Egyptian divinity as instruments of rule. But perhaps the truest description came from an anonymous scribe who served in Alexandria during her lifetime. His note, written in fragile ink, survives on a scrap of papyrus stored today in Berlin. It reads, "She smiled as they crowned her, but her smile was not for them." No one knows who he was, a servant perhaps, or someone who simply saw what others refused to see. That Arsinoe was not the embodiment of divine love, but of human resilience. The centuries turned her into legend, and legend turned into myth. Her temples crumbled, her dynasty fell, and yet her story still whispers through the cracks of history. Not as the tale of a goddess who married her brother, but as the echo of a woman who survived the impossible. And maybe that's why her story endures, because every age needs its reflection. And Arsinoe's life reflects a truth older than time itself, that the line between worship and sacrifice is thin, and women have too often been placed on one side only to die on the other. If you stand today on the shores of Alexandria at sunset, the sea turns to bronze, and the wind carries the scent of ancient salt. Somewhere beneath those waves lie the stones of her palace, the fragments of her tomb. The world around is loud, but the past speaks softly. You might hear it, a woman's voice, steady and quiet, cutting through the noise of centuries. "I was made a goddess," it says, "because men feared what I was before that, a queen." And then, only the sea remains. This is not just history. It's a mirror of power, silence, and survival. A story of a woman who was forced to marry her own brother and became immortal because of it. Subscribe for more forbidden stories from history's dark side.